So just before we get started, I just wanted to confirm, and I'm sure we'll do a little bit of a roundtable on introductions, but is it okay that we use this recording on our neighborhood association site after the meeting's done? Just wanted to make sure I get that confirmed with everybody.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, all right, cool.
I'll give you my photo release, Jacob.
Yeah, well, you know what? I had you sign that when you didn't realize it a while ago. So.
Did the notification come through that it's recording, just to let you all know that? Okay, good.
Yeah, I see it.
You on my side, great.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for this time and thank you for allowing us to record a meeting with you. We did ask our members if they had any further questions, newer questions, and we forwarded those to you this morning along with a letter from Gar. And he had lined out some ideas, especially as it pertains to the historic preservation of our neighborhood. So on the call right now is Jacob Walls and Brian Whitaker, and I don't know who else. I know Jim Keene is here representing Ramsey Hill. And we just really care about this project. We have been watching it and trying to support the city and yet support our neighbors as they voice concerns and questions. And so that brings us here today. And again, I'm Kathy Mays for anybody else that's on the call that I can't see. So maybe I'll toss it over to the city and then we'll do a quick Ramsey Hill hello. And then Mary was going to give a brief presentation.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Kathy. Hello to all of you who have not met. My name is Alice Messer. I'm a landscape architect and I manage design and construction for St. Paul Parks and Recreation. I'll have the rest of the team go around and do introductions. We are also really happy for the invitation today. We have a pretty healthy presentation. It's just because it's a lot of information. It'll probably be about 20 minutes. We did get your questions. We'll do our best to answer them. They did come in this morning, but I think we have a pretty good grasp. But if not, we'll follow up. But I just want to use the most of this hour. So I'm going to turn it over. Ruben, you want to go? And then we'll go with Parks team.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ruben Collins. I'm a transportation planner in the Department of Public Works here at the city. Thanks.
Mary?
Great. I'll jump in. Mary Norton. I'm a landscape architect at St. Paul Parks and Recreation and project manager for the Summit Avenue Regional Trail Master Plan project. Go ahead, Brett.
Thanks. Oh, Brett, you're muted.
Hello, I'm Brett Husong. I'm a landscape architect. I am in design and construction in Parks and Rec, and I'm providing support to Mary on the project. Claire, go ahead.
Hey everyone, Claire Cloyd. I am the public service manager for St. Paul Parks and Recreation, primarily supporting on some communication support for this project and helping get that out. So here to kind of track for follow-up needs today. Thank you.
Great.
Awesome.
Sounds good. Jim, I see, and Libby on the call. Go ahead.
Yeah, they're on the RHA side. I suppose we could probably do a quick round on the RHA folks. If you guys want to get, I know Kathy, you've already given your introduction. We can just go around and if you guys just want to call it your board position, but anything else that might be, contextually relevant. So Jacob Walls, though, I'm the social events chair for RHA. The chair probably matters less than the fact that all of us are here just on the board. Yeah, anyways, Brian?
Brian Whitaker, crime prevention chair. Kick it over to Jim Keene.
Jim Keene, historic preservation chair.
Libby Reed, I'm the secretary.
Thanks, guys. Before we jump into it, Kathy, I was hoping to just give a little bit of context of where this meeting lines up in our calendar. I don't know if there's anything, Kathy, you wanted to call out or preamble. Okay.
No.
So, all right, cool. So it's just, I think, helpful to kind of understand within like RHA, where does this meeting line up? Is it like, on the front end, tail end, or where, how does it sit with our members? Our member base has told us early on that they wanted us to be engaged in this project. You know, keep them informed, be engaged, and then if possible, give them agency for engaging and potentially course correcting where they believe you know, they have reason to do so. So we wanted to take a very appropriate approach rather than knee-jerk reaction to say, are we a for or against this as a neighborhood association? You know, we don't really believe that we've got the mandate or kind of representation, at least just to say yes or no. So our take was to poll the community at the start, you know, say, all right, if you want us to be engaged, what is the mood of the neighborhood? So we polled our membership, I want to say back in June, and got feedback on where they sit with this. Is it on a gradation scale of for or against? We solicited that, got that back. It was a pretty healthy response rate. And then we wanted to give opportunities for them to be informed. So we had a meeting at the cathedral. We had SARPA there. We had SOS. It was really well attended. Over 150 residents joined. And then we wanted to have other ways for engaging. So there's been a number of different kind of like just neighborhood get-togethers, people talking, but also then obviously engaging with the city. As I mentioned, this is kind of a bookended approach. So on the other side of this, we're going to meet with our city council member, Russell, now that Daitau's gone, be able to talk with him a little bit, get his take, and then also share the results of our poll and then the bookend poll. So after this, we'll have another poll with neighbors and say, hey, you know, we gave you ample opportunity to kind of know the details. You got the details from all sides. You've been able to engage with their city council member, you know, kind of where do you stand on this today? And then we want to be able to channel that into Russell now, you know, and be able to give him all of the information that he needs so that ultimately when this does go to a vote, he knows where the neighborhood stands. So that kind of gives you an idea of the through line or the story narrative here from an RHA perspective. So kind of take that for what it's worth. Alice, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. That's really helpful. As Mary's getting the slide deck ready, I'll just kick it off and also tell you where we're at in the process. First, we're a little bit behind schedule. We have been working for over a year on this. This parkway is really important to not only the residents, it's really important to the Parks Department, to Public Works, and it's just taken longer than we all anticipated. The impetus for this work was knowing that Public Works had a segment of Summit Avenue planned for reconstruction. That's why we are doing this work. I think there's a lot of questions of like, why now? Why Summit? That was the impetus for it, because we really believe across the city that when Summit gets rebuilt, this is our chance to think to the future. We have no money right now for implementation of the trail. This is purely a master plan. And in the future. So we are thinking 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And it's really complex because all the things that we're hearing from the neighborhood are really important to us too. We're trying to find that right balance. So historic character, mature trees, and safety. So Mary's going to go through all of that. I just want to start off with that and say that we hear you, and all these things are really important to us. And that's our job, is to pull it all together and to come out with a plan that puts all these things together. So in terms of our timeline, we're close. We're working internally. I'm really grateful that Ruben is here, because this really is a project with Parks and Public Works, and our work together has been really collaborative and helpful. So we're in the internal discussion point. End of October, we'll have the open house. So that will be the chance for people to see the recommendations of the master plan. It'll be about 60%, so it's not complete. There'll be 30 days for comments on that document. And then it will go to Parks Commission. There'll be a public hearing at Parks Commission. Considering how that goes, hopefully Parks Commission will make a recommendation to City Council. City Council will take a vote on it. And then after pending that vote, it'll go to the Metropolitan Council through their regional parks process. So there's still a few steps along the way. It'll be late fall, probably early 2023 until those steps are done. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. You'll hear it again in the presentation, but again, thanks for reaching out. We're really happy to share this information today. So Mary, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Alice. I appreciate that. And yes, thank you everyone for the chance to have this conversation. I know we want to get everyone hearing as much of the same information as we can, knowing the interest of this place, of course. And thanks for teeing up the process, Alice. I think that's also really important as we talk about kind of where we're at now and what we can look ahead to. So the slides on screen, just thumbs up, people can see that okay? Yes, all right. This was presented as information only to the Parks Commission a couple weeks ago on the 8th. So just to give again a sort of a project overview and kind of ground people again where context of the project and where we're at in the process right now. So sharing that with you just as an introduction of project background and planning. Alice touched on this a little bit as far as how this has interfaced with Public Works and the interest in creating a plan that responds to needs for reconstruction. We'll touch on engagement. Jacob, thank you for kind of outlining Ramsey Hill's approach to engagement. I think that's excellent to hear, kind of a thoughtful, certainly that thoughtful approach within your own organizations. We're working as well to reach as many audiences as we can to get a broad reach on engagement, and we'll let you know what we're hearing. And then design, we'll talk about where we're at in design right now and kind of this idea of separated trail facilities. What does that mean? And what balance are we trying to find within that corridor right away? And then we'll touch on the area projects. So again, kind of going back to that beginning point of starting this conversation with roadway reconstruction and the need to think into the future about what happens in that corridor. So the parkway experience of Summit Avenue is incredible, and it's a design landscape from its inception in the late 1800s. That experience we can see and feel today. It's a place many people want to be. It's an important multimodal corridor across the city, and so this is a moment in time to again be thinking about how people are not only moving now, but how they're going to be moving in the corridor in the future, and how we can bring that regional trail facility alongside those important pieces that create that parkway experience. So it's really important. A huge goal for the regional trail itself is to improve the recreation experience and safety for all users on the corridor. We hear often that people do not feel safe biking in this area. Not everyone, and again, all users, all abilities, and the safety and comfort. That is a perception. People's stress tolerance differs, but we want to create a treadway that as many people can use it and that it's accessible for everyone. We want to preserve the historic care corridor and integrity of the trees. And the way that we're looking at doing that is by removing parking on one side or really using that paved footprint to the extent possible of what's on the surface now. And then at its core, improving that east-west connection. So as a regional trail and a regional facility, connecting other regional units in that network is really important, and Summit provides this critical east-west connection across the city. I'll jump back to that slide in a minute. There we go. But I want to touch on the planning context because it really illustrates that regional park, the regional network. In the dash purple lines are regional trail search corridors, which is what this area is currently in the planning process, and what we're looking to implement as a regional trail. Again, that pivotal kind of east-west connection. I think this is a helpful graphic to think of broader context outside of Summit and what role it's playing in not only this area, but the broader region. So I'll jump back up a few more slides, but I think that's a helpful graphic to touch on that point. What I have in the slide deck here shows what we're calling a heat map. We talk about the roadway and the starting of this conversation, as starting this conversation with paving. So what you see on screen here is a reflection of kind of how people experience the roadways. So this is a combination of pavement condition and traffic volume. So the higher the traffic volume and the poorer the pavement condition, the redder that line is. And so you can see a bright red line across Summit Avenue from a roadway perspective. And so it drives home what we all know as we're moving along Summit and feeling those potholes. And so the roadway itself, what's underneath that surface, needs to be reconstructed in the future. And so that brings home again why we're having this conversation about what it looks like in the future from a roadway perspective. So on that, I'll touch on recreational planning. So as Alice mentioned, kind of that importance of thinking long-term about, when cities are reconstructing things or looking to the future of planning, and recreational planning, how important those conversations are to have and why this is an important one to have now. Recreational planning for Summit Avenue, as I mentioned, a design landscape, has been a part of planning for a very long time. Recreational paths here, the plan for Mississippi River Boulevard, also a recreational planning document. So as we think long-term about what facilities look like and how they need to be developed, this is a similar path that we've been through. Not exactly like this, but thinking long-term about recreational planning is a point in this conversation going forward. To give additional planning context, so why are we looking at this, and how did this start, and how did this come to be? So in the St. Paul Comprehensive Plan, this is identified again as a regional trail search corridor, which means looking to connect those other regional units across the city. It's also reflected in the Metropolitan Council's Regional Parks Policy Plan as a place to search for a regional connection. And these documents are developed, through a process with robust engagement as well. So these predate where we are right now. We're in that next step where we're looking at, okay, what does a regional trail look like in this corridor, or what's feasible? About regional trails, so it's really important that these corridors provide recreational opportunities along linear pathways in the metropolitan area. This would be considered a linking trail, so the importance of it passing through the regional park system to significant natural resource areas. They're selected for the ability to intersect with local trail networks, areas that serve commuting routes in addition to recreational, so both, and we see that on Summit Avenue. So I think we hear a lot about why Summit, why here. It's functioning in many ways in that capacity, and this is taking it to another level to make sure everyone has access to it. It's a comfortable experience and can look to the future on that. So regional facilities also connect to multiple places of public interest. Architectural building sites, cultural and historical cultural resources, tourist destinations. So again, that activity is occurring now on Summit and reinforces why regional trail here. And why a separated trail facility? So separated essentially means, I think we had said in one of the questions had elevated. So it really just means bringing that behind the curb. So providing physical separation between what's on the road and the trail itself. And so separated trail facility, the traffic volume on Summit carries enough to which vehicle best practices would recommend a separated facility. Industry standards also recommend that, as well as just creating a more comfortable and safe experience for all users and abilities. Bringing that behind the curb provides more of a buffer and more separation for uses. There's that planning context slide. I won't linger on that. This should give some project context to wards and districts. The areas that this passes through across the city, quite a few. 4 wards, 5 district councils involved in the engagement of this process and engaged in being impacted by a future regional facility across St. Paul. Touching on engagement, so some of the engagement that we have, there's several channels. There's interactive website, Engage St. Paul, where we've received a lot of feedback, as well as targeted going out to the public to have drop-in events, things like that, virtual engagement series. So we've been hearing a lot of great feedback from community members, a wide range. I think the summary of themes that we're hearing, certainly green space is a huge priority. Making park connections, the importance of those medians and boulevards, those broad landscapes are really critical to that experience and something to be maintained. The perception of safety, crossings and turning movements, reducing speed on Summit and kind of looking for ways to calm traffic. And again, those proximity uses, and certainly facility conditions as well. So the importance of paving the surface and making those conditions maintainable long-term and short-term. And then certainly no change, maintaining what's there and having the on-street conditions as a function to exist as it is. This is an example of some of those hotspots we see in the mapping, which has been really helpful as designers we're looking at, again, where community priorities are and where we can be focusing attention on issues people are seeing. So example interest areas, again, additional valued green spaces, but also thinking about conflicts at intersections and crossings, and opportunities for additional connections off of this regional corridor. So to pivot to design, so where we're at in design, we're looking at several, well, essentially, we're looking at a few different options for what that trail configuration could be, or that cross section could be in the corridor. But at its core of all this, green spaces are absolutely integral to design. So making sure that green spaces remain as broad recreational spaces, those canopies, those are all incredibly important to that parkway experience and something that we want to come alongside with. The historic districts and sites, so Summit Avenue passes through two historic districts, West Avenue, Summit Historic District, and also the Historic Hill District, as you know. So it intersects with quite a bit of historic significance. So again, what we propose, we're making sure we balance those needs of future as well as complementing what exists there. And so the trail design alternatives that we're looking at really prioritize, again, that parkway green space and preserving to the extent with preserving those mature landscape features by reallocating existing transportation spaces. So looking at that paved footprint, knowing that that roadway is going to need to be reconstructed. What can we do to the extent we can in that paved surface to not only minimize impacts to roots and existing mature trees, but also to recognize kind of those spatial relationships in the roadway, which are important to the streetscape and cultural resources component of Summit Avenue's layout. So providing that separated trail, again, to the extent we can minimize impacts at the curb, it meets those objectives. And here are a couple examples, again, with just sort of elevated or behind the curb, separated facilities, bring that treadway behind, above that road surface, not an on-street bikeway. Where we're at in the design process, so things that we're looking at right now, given the different design scenarios, things when we talk about the importance of trees and tree health, we can't speak in absolutes on it when construction occurs adjacent to boulevards and trees. There's always going to be a certain level of risk associated with that, whether there's a trail there or not. If we're reconstructing infrastructure, there's a risk there. And so what this is doing at this point in time, we're looking at, again, that relationship of curb and activity relative to structural root zones and thinking about risk tolerance, kind of high, medium, and low vulnerability to those critical root zones and structural root zones. So this diagram here reflects kind of what's happening underground, right? So the root zones underneath trees, if you kind of go out to the edge of that tree and drop down, there's roots existing underneath there. And what we call that is kind of that critical root zone. It cut that in half essentially, and then you have what's called the structural root zone. And so the closer we get to that, the more that risk threshold goes up for the health of the tree. There's so many variables to tree health and tree health conditions that again, we can't speak in absolutes on it. Different species are going to react differently to construction than others that might tolerate stress more. But at a master plan, we can at least take a look at what we're talking about in construction as a baseline. If we reconstruct everything, what does that impact look like? And then if we adjust those curbs, what's our risk tolerance there? So it's important to note, portions of Summit Avenue, as I mentioned, excuse me, were built more than 90 years ago. So there's a certain level of need for infrastructure to be rebuilt, and we want to be conscious of that as we go forward and think about root zones and root protection and what happens underneath the roadway. And with that, there's a couple different trail facility types that we're looking at, one of which is a one-way paired trail on the left, which reflects, again, a series of one-way trails. So similar to the patterns that you see out there now on the road, but this is brought behind the curb, essentially, but follows similar traffic pattern. In both of these scenarios, you see removal of parking on one side, or 50%, so to speak, to be able to reallocate that space. And there's a buffer between sort of the treadway itself and the road surface. The other example here we have is a two-way facility that we're looking at kind of potentially for east of Lexington, where we can stay kind of in between the curbs. There's different benefits and drawbacks to each of these. There's different challenges. I think it's important to recognize the geometry of Summit, as you know, changes from Mississippi River Boulevard to Kellogg. There are some instances not only where we have a 200-foot right-of-way west of Lexington, so we just have different physical space, but there's also areas where there's a double median and where those one-way roads come together and go through a double median and then conjoin again. So we want to be able to create something that has consistency for users to the extent possible. We're minimizing those transitions, the types that occur. And so it takes, we're kind of working through what that looks like essentially, and how we can kind of minimize those transitions and make for as much of an intuitive trail experience for users that we can. And with that, I'll touch on area projects. I mentioned, you saw this heat map earlier, again, reiterating that importance of what's happening under the road and the need for reconstruction. And reconstruction of a roadway includes, utilities. That's excavation. That's a more robust endeavor than, say, a mill and overlay. So mill and overlay is where we're removing that top surface and then we're putting new material on top. And so mill and overlay, while it might improve the road condition, there is still going to be a need to update or rebuild sections of roadway at some point in time. So just again, reiterating that mill and overlay, I think we have that work underway right now. You can see mill and overlay out on Summit Avenue occurring. Essentially from Snelling to Lexington will be completed for mill and overlay. And then, as Alice mentioned earlier in the presentation, what started this conversation is programming for reconstruction of Lexington to Victoria. So that reconstruction being utilities, sidewalks, curb and gutter, everything, infrastructure in those paved surfaces to be rebuilt. So that's that bigger initiative there. And then other projects in context. So right now, so Grand Avenue is also looking at reconstruction in 2024 of Fairview to Snelling. And then the last line is the regional trail. So spanning this again is this planning process. As Alice mentioned, it's not funded for construction at this point. This is a master plan, and we'd be looking, potentially 5 years out for a type of facility. If approved, we'd then move towards that path towards actual design and construction, and setting that course. So this is that first part of the conversation for a master plan. And with that, I'll pivot to the schedule. As Alice mentioned, we are a bit behind. It's given the complexities. So we are looking at, again, that maybe 60%. So kind of that open house and public comment period. We're looking at late October. And then we'll pivot in the fall based on responses we hear and additional design work towards that 90%. And looking at kind of fall, winter 2023 to move through the approval processes for City Council, Parks Commission, City Council, and the Metropolitan Council, Parks and Open Space Commission. So that's a lot of me talking. I don't want to use a lot of time here. We want to make sure there's time for questions and some dialogue. Any questions? I'll open it right now, or comments from my colleagues. Anything you want to add that I may have missed? Take a breath.
Yeah, I'm prepared to jump in on the RHA side, but I do want to pause and maybe let other folks on the city side jump in if they do have additions. Okay.
I don't think so. I want to talk a little bit more about community engagement because, again, Mary had a lot of information. You did great, Mary, presenting it in an expedient amount of time. So I will say we have heard pretty strongly from residents along Summit Avenue. Our job as landscape architects and city staff is to look at who we're hearing from and think about the regional context. So we have done intentional engagement to reach out to people outside Summit Avenue. So we've gone to Safe Summer Nights, Little Africa. We were at the Mobility Mingle. And it's really interesting to hear the responses from residents off of the direct corridor. We heard pretty strongly, and we're hearing really strongly that people don't feel safe on Summit. If they bike on it, they're on the sidewalk. So I want to make sure that's part of the conversation. Again, this is a regional facility. Every voice is important on this. And again, we're we're charged with planning for the most ability of users. And as we look at the recommendations based on the number of cyclists and the number of vehicle cars, the recommendation is it should be a separated facility. So finding that design solution and then thinking about how it's going to be phased with time and where transition points happen is really challenging. So that's where we're at right now, is working with our public works colleagues to put the pieces together. So that's, yeah.
No, that's really helpful, Alice. I appreciate that, and I think the engagement with some of those, you know, other maybe non-business related organizations or nonprofits is it's helpful to know. Actually, that kind of is a good dovetail into some of the questions that we provided to you, but there's also questions coming into us other than what we've got to. So I think that there's maybe some thematic questions we'd like to cover, and I know Brian's going to be prepared to cover some of those. But you guys have answered a number of those already. If it's possible, maybe we can table a kind of just a generic list of questions, and if you guys could answer those offline, then we can just kind of marry those up with this video later, and we'll just put that out there as general content, and we can speak to more thematic things now. But most of the questions that we've gotten back center around three categories: logistics, safety, and funding. I would say bundled inside of logistics, one of the common questions we get are around how have businesses been engaged. And RHA is not a business association. We're an unofficial neighborhood association, right? So we work with business, or we talk to our business neighbors and such, but we don't have that kind of that official tie-in. So curious about the, and Brian, not to steal your thunder there, but just kind of curious about the level of engagement you've had with nonprofits, and I'm thinking of things like the German American Institute that's on Summit, you know, that might not be a traditional business, but also other folks along Summit.
Mary, do you want to talk about the Design Advisory Committee and representatives?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Jacob. So yeah, as part of the process, a design advisory committee is formed. We reach out to businesses. We call folks on the corridor and institutions to see if they want to have representatives on it and have those conversations. And so we did have people from, let's see, St. Thomas, as well as McAllister. We have someone from the representing the Grand Avenue Business Association. So we have folks who have wanted to participate. Some have not wanted to participate or remain neutral, and that's okay too. But you know, we keep that design advisory group informed. There were a series of meetings with those groups to hear those voices. So I would say that that's how we've been able to engage for the most part. People have also reached out to us individually in a similar informal capacity. We'll have, you know, phone calls, conversations to answer those questions. So that also happens outside of the design advisory committee meeting. So just answering specific questions to the extent we can. So
if you're not in a business association yourself, you can proactively join, which I know we've joined that way. Otherwise, you've done best effort to try to reach out to organizations as well. So
yeah, yep,
makes sense. Brian, I don't know if there are questions that are pressing. I know funding, that I think a number of the questions around funding were answered here, and I think I was even slightly surprised to see just how far out we were from the potential actual design phase here, and you know, potential construction. I think there might be some other folks out there that have similar that might be news to them or revealing. So anyways, why don't I hand it over to you, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I just have a quick follow-up question on the business groups. Mary or Alice, if you know, well, I'll just name them. There's no reason not to. I mean, we're most interested in, you know, obviously the Cathedral, Hill House, Summit Manor, German American Institute, University Club, and others. If you know, we're most interested in making sure that their employees, their contractors, and their patrons have the ability to access the facilities, and primarily through parking and on-street parking. Are you able to address with any detail to what extent, if any, a parking study has gone into your plan here? And that's one question. The second follow-up there would be, you know, if where should we point folks from these businesses to engage with you? Since it sounds like they might not already be talking to you all.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Great question. So I think from the context of parking, so certainly on-street parking within the right of way is always a balance of need for users within that space and for both public and private to serve those entities. So our initial review looked at the corridor. We did an initial study on parking counts and parking utilization from previous studies, as well as part of this east of Lexington, just to see, okay, how is parking being used, and is there a snapshot that can give us an idea of if there's any movement to study that further as a design recommendation. And what we saw is that in general, again, parking being underutilized east of, certainly corridor wide, but east of Lexington, with the exception of a few different points at Dale, there was higher use consistently between studies. And so if anything, it gives us that initial look to say, okay, if we take an approach to reduce parking and be able to vary it side to side and provide some on street, so we might be reducing capacity by 50%, but still able to take a design approach where we're looking at providing some parking, can we still meet as many needs as we can? So no doubt these are difficult conversations to have. It's never easy, but I think it's a balance to where we can try to achieve and meet those needs. And as far as level of detail, that won't come until a design phase when we start looking at actually laying out and making those context-based decisions of what's happening street side and really looking into it further. So at a master plan, we have some reason to believe we can approach that reasonably in a design situation. So anything my colleagues would add to that for parking, let me know.
Yeah, Mary, are the parking studies there on the Engage St. Paul website? If people wanted to link to those, is that we could share that link. Yep.
Yeah. Go right ahead.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the questions again that will float, that would be a little tactical to go Q&A right now. I would assume there are links that you guys would be able to just provide us that might be more effective for scale. So
yeah, for sure. And when we have the draft master plan available, there'll be an appendix in there that shows tech memos and things like that we're working through to support some of those design decisions in the document, so people can look at more detail there.
Okay,
that's great. That gets to the spirit of where a lot of questions are coming from, is what data was collected, where, how. So that'd be really helpful.
Sure. And I believe, Brian, you also asked, how can people, engage if they haven't already? I
think especially businesses and nonprofits.
Yeah. I mean, they're certainly welcome to reach out individually if they have questions to me, email, phone, that's fine. Or Engage St. Paul, I think, is just a great resource. If there's very specific, I really like the mapping tool on there. I think it gives us a very real-time knowledge of what's happening and what constraints people are seeing who live there and experience it. So I think
as a commenter on that map, I can attest to its utility. And
I don't know. As designers, I found it really helpful just to know what issues people are running into. We won't solve them all in the master plan by any means, but there's a great knowledge base of people working there that's visible and helps us kind of focus in where we need to. So
for sure. It's also nice to see what other concerns people have, so that you can either, add to it, or know that you don't have to say that because it's already been said. So it's a wonderful tool.
Great, thank you.
I think to Brian's point of just kind of pointing people in the right direction, and a lot of people asking for statistics or data-driven responses. Some of the questions that are coming through are also around like average daily traffic, ADT, and very kind of gets into the technical terms of surveying accidents and relative to traffic along the corridor there. So not to say that we ask you to respond to that right now, but I think when we float the questions to you, being able to, a lot of people are interested in what does that look like within this corridor? Do we have the metrics on that? And can we kind of prove out, is there some kind of directional proving that this would address safety, or is safety more of a theoretical? I don't know if you have kind of a general take on that.
Well, I think, yeah, good question. I think I will say as part of the master plan, a study we're going to be looking at with our traffic engineering is something that looks at crash data, right? Like what is happening on Summit and, what is that piece of the puzzle that we're talking about and how can that be improved? So it's a lens to be looking at. It's not the lens. I think there are many different components to creating informed decisions about trail making. But that will be a part of it. That's another one of those memos that'll be in the document to say, here's what's happening over the last 10 years, and it is what it is. And that's kind of where that situation's at. I don't know, Ruben, if you want to add anything from a higher level from transportation planning and safety or citywide as approach to that concept or that idea of making spaces safer or better. We're looking, I know in the master plan too, I won't cut you off, but toolkits of making intersections, best practices that can be done on Summit to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety. Go ahead, Ruben.
I don't have a lot to add, only just, I mean, I think what we started this very Mary, what you started your presentation with just the context of why we're looking at Summit. I think it's really important to keep in mind that this whole process is not starting because we looked at crash data on Summit and said, wow, there's a crash problem here. We need to do something about that. It started because there is a need for a regional trail that has a lot of purposes, one of which is enhancing safety. But there are other, more intangible benefits of regional trails as well that we are trying to provide within the Summit Avenue corridor. The trail that exists along Mississippi River Boulevard today was not built because people thought there was a crash problem on Mississippi River Boulevard. So I just think that's important to keep in mind. It is a guiding principle of public works that anytime we build a bike facility, we don't immediately just kind of replace what was there. If we're reconstructing a street, we always look at best practices and say, what would the best, what are best practice national guidance that we would follow? What would it tell us about the right bike facility? And that's what we try to provide, whether there are, demonstrable crash issues or not. We, as a department, we do not. It is not our goal to be reactive to crash statistics, but to follow best practices to make sure we are proactively trying to prevent crashes from happening in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's safety by design within what's kind of already being planned there. Makes sense. Brian, I don't know if there are other pressing questions.
One other thing that's sort of as we generalizing these dozens of questions that we've received. I mean, one thing that kind of pops up here is our members and neighbors having a difficulty visualizing and or really gaining a better handling of what this looks like, how they would experience it, this trail, I mean. Do you have any examples that we might be able to point people towards, either in the city, regionally, maybe even something that people might be able to find on the internet to sort of see what this looks like, what a trail like this would look like if it ever to be elevated and for it to be off the street?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few examples. I'll say yes and no. There's no place like Summit. I think the geometry, the volumes, the spatial conditions there are different and unique, and I think that's why it's certainly been a robust and complicated process to come up with the best trail. Now that said, there are certainly built examples. I'm thinking, and Ruben, I'm sure you can jump in and tell me a whole list of them, but at least recent trails on Como between is it Hamlin, just east of Hamlin, is a separated trail facility in sort of a residential context. Again, very different, but at least shows you what behind the curb means and what happens when trails pass over driveways and buffer spaces, those kinds of things. Is a good built example. It's a two-way facility, so it's different than one way. They're all a little unique, but that at least gives you an idea of what it means to be behind the curb and how that can pass. Any other places my colleagues would point to? That's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, if there's like one or two more, that'd be really helpful.
I think Wheelock Parkway is a great example to look at. The stretch on Johnson Parkway is a little bit different. I mean, there's a median along there, but again, it's hard to have a direct comparison to Summit.
Sure.
But that's another one. And then Ruben, in terms of the one-way facility, Montreal Avenue and the new Highland Bridge development, that's kind of, I think, St. Paul's first one-way facility.
Yep, throughout the Highland Bridge development, there are some examples of one-way facilities. Those are a little bit different from what's being proposed along Summit, just because in Highland Bridge, the sidewalk and the bikeway are directly adjacent to each other, with kind of a wider boulevard between the bikeway and the street, whereas along Summit, the design concepts are generally providing more of that wide landscape buffer between the sidewalk and the bikeway, with the bikeway kind of being a little closer to the street.
Okay.
So not a perfect example. But.
And it is the design for east of Lexington one way, or is that still potentially one way and two way? I thought that was primarily a one way east.
It's to be east of Lexington. It's to be determined right now. Right now, we between the curbs, we're looking at a two-way. I'll go back to this. We're looking at an option for a two-way, but I think we're also, again, thinking through continuity of a facility and trying to minimize transition types and things like that. So I would say to be determined. We're looking at both one-way and two-way and just kind of evaluating that right now.
Okay. All right. I know we've got a little bit of time left. And I just want to make sure kind of thematically we're getting at things. I think, really great conversation around funding and timelines there. I think that answers a lot of questions for people. I think certain heartburn that might be out there about like impeding timescales. There's a little bit of a longer tail there than I think most people realize, and I think that's good. Also, within that long tail, there's opportunity for agency. So there are folks that they can work with the city council member, they can work with Met Council, they can make their voice heard a little bit more as plans get flushed out. So I think when we're talking about funding and timelines, I think that's really helpful information. So Mary, really appreciate you going through all that detail. In terms of safety, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think some people are looking at like, is this a safety first thing? And they get, there might be some concerns over like, if that's the driving motivator, where's the data? But I think Ruben, you called out, I think pretty well articulated that this is safety by design, proactively, not reactionary. And but you're looking largely at the trail first, and then how do you do best practices based on that? If we're missing any safety questions, Brian, let me know. But again, we'll float like the list of the short list of questions, and then we'll hand that over to you guys. Logistics, you talked about businesses, Brian. I do think that there are some interesting questions in here a lot, around historic preservation. One of them comes in around that. I'm not going to read through this, but essentially, that state statute and city ordinance does not exempt a government entity, including the city, right, in terms of meeting the requirements around historic districts. And I think there's a lot of concerns around the granite curbs on Summit. I feel like that's been addressed, but I can't put my finger on where or if. So could you guys, is that something we'd speak to now, or is that maybe a later conversation?
Well, I'm going to start from a process perspective. So again, the master plan itself, we won't go through a 106 if there's federal funding, that sort of formal review process until a project is designed. And so what we're trying to do is balance what we see as sort of complementary uses or things that we can do within these areas that kind of set us up to be able to go through that formal process at a later date. So we won't have enough detail to move through that. Not that it won't apply, it's just not applying at this moment in time in the master plan. We fully expect it to at further down the line.
That's a design phase question. Okay.
Absolutely. The detail that is in that is when a project is designed, for sure. So we're trying to create a space that makes sense to complement that and work through that process.
I think that might help a lot too in addressing questions, and I understand you're responding to a large number of neighborhoods and groups asking you guys questions and being inundated by it. But I think just being able to understand the sequencing, like this is a relevant question. Is it material or is it relevant at this sequence, this moment? So, okay. that sounds good. Is Kathy still on the call? She may have had to drop.
It looks like she's still in. I think she was going to be in transit.
Nope, I'm
Yeah.
still
Oh.
still here. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jacob and Brian for
Yep.
the great questions. I think everything's been asked and answered, and I'd look to Mary and Alice to where do we go from here?
Great. Well, thank you. I would say the next thing will be the open house, which will it'll most likely be late October. So look for that invite. Encourage people to come. Our plan is to hold it on Summit, so we'll be on site, which is always a good thing to do to get people to the place we're talking about. And then when the master plan's released, to read it, send comments. It will be at like 60%. So any way to share that will be super helpful. And then really the public hearing will be at Parks Commission. So again, we'll publicize that. We'll use the Engage St. Paul website as a resource for that. I do not know if City Council will be a public hearing or not. It's the council president and council members make that determination. Not all park master plans have public hearings. So if people ask that, I don't know. It's not, we don't control that. But the Parks Commission, that's an important date. And then I think, Mary, I think the thing we missed too is Transportation Commission. Well, that's part of the sequence as well, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, yes. Transportation Commission will probably be the first one. If a recommendation moves forward, then we go to Parks Commission. Then we would go to City Council, then to MPOS, Metropolitan Parks Open Space Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
And yeah, if there's any questions, we do our best to respond. Sometimes it's not the same day. That's Mary's inbox is pretty full, but we do try to get back to people, and we have been getting back to people. So there's a frequently asked questions page as well. A lot of these recurring questions are on there, and it's addressed. That's a really kind of quick resource if people don't have a lot of time to go through the website, which has quite a bit of information.
And you mean on the Engage St.
Yep.
Paul website? Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Well, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. I don't know exactly what percentage of your day is given over to this, but I know there's a lot of prep work that goes into it. So I just want to acknowledge that we know that it's a lot of time and effort. So really appreciate Alice, you organizing it, and Mary, you prepping for it and giving the presentation. So thank you for that. And everybody else from the city that joined to answer questions. I think just in terms of for us next steps, we'll just send out just a short, probably a list of like 5 to 10 questions that we want to make sure we give due diligence to our members that are kind of generalized based off of the questions we got. Mary, I think we'll pose those to you. Maybe you could just kind of help forward like, hey, here's the link where you can provide information, or if you're like, again, kind of sequencing, like, great question,
Absolutely.
not something we can answer in the next 2 years or 3 years.
Right.
That's 4 years down the road. That'd help. So, okay. Well, on behalf of RHA, again, this is, I know on the board, everyone's got different opinions. Across the neighborhood, everyone's got different opinions. So it's just really great to be able to have open conversations. So, anybody else on the board want to say anything before we close out?
Can I ask just a quick, this is a comment from what I've been hearing neighbors talk about. This has come up in this session, which I've really enjoyed, by the way, so thank you very much to all of you. I am now driving the River Road every day from Summit Avenue to the university campus for a job-related thing. And even though there's a wonderful trail there, there's a certain number of bicyclists that insist on using the roadbed. And neighbors around here, I think, are concerned that the same thing is potentially going to happen with Summit Avenue. How can we allay that fear?
Ruben,
Right.
do you want to take that?
Well, sure. I mean, I'll do my best. I think the honest answer is that might happen. There is potential for that to happen. Some people will use a separated bike facility. Some people won't. It is one of the biggest challenges we face in trying to build out bike networks is that people ride bikes. A lot of different kinds of people ride bikes for a lot of different reasons and have a lot of different preferences as they do it. It's not a surprise that someone who's going 15, 20 miles an hour wants something different than a parent riding with a young child. And it is, you know, it is one of the hard decisions we have to make, that we have to choose whether we're going, you know, which of those two, you know, groups or types of users we might try to accommodate with a bike facility. What we have now works really well for people going really fast and doesn't work very well at all for, you know, parents and kids or people who are looking for more separation from cars. It is our intent, not just on Summit, but citywide, to build more separated facilities and more places that accommodates to the most vulnerable users among us. So it is possible that some bicyclists will continue to ride in the street, and that's not different from what we would experience on any other street in St. Paul that doesn't have a bike lane in the street, for example. So it's, you know, it's legal to ride in the street, and it's incumbent on all of us to treat other road users with respect.
Right, exactly. Thank you for that. I just want to add last, I really like the idea of suggesting that neighbors go look at Como Avenue by the park and the fairgrounds, because it's a real world example of how this could work in a really positive way. So I'm certainly going to suggest that.
Thanks, Jim. Great point. Great. Yeah, and I think that was a really valuable thing to bring up. We hear that quite a bit, and I think you responded well, Ruben. Appreciate that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the time, and I know we'll be talking again soon.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
That's good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
care,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Bye.